This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Hey everybody, I am very excited. Our guest today is a good friend of mine, Alex Joyce. He is the managing partner of Cascadia Partners. They do real estate planning and services. They work across the country. I'm really excited because I've been wanting to get Alex on the show for a while. So, hey Alex, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it is truly a pleasure. You guys do some incredible work, and we've had long talks about this, but I really wanted to introduce planning and zoning to a broader audience because it really ties in with our theme of sustainability. But why don't you tell the listeners what your background is and what you guys do?
Sure. So I am trained as a planner, but also have another master's degree in commercial real estate development. And the work of the firm really is at the intersection of urban planning and real estate. And it was designed to operate in that space. And the primary work of the firm focuses in on a few lines of business. So we help public and private sector clients figure out what their assets can be. So public agencies who do things like healthcare service or government agencies, they are not real estate developers, but they want to have a positive impact in their community. They own real estate, but they don't often think about what that real estate asset could be beyond just serving the primary mission of their agency. So we help them think strategically about what their real estate holdings could do for the community, whether that is some sort of social mission like affordable housing, or whether it's a catalytic economic impact. So there's a variety of public and private sector clients that we have, helping them think through that process and then execute on it, and usually in partnership with a private developer. And then there's the world of urban planning, which really comes down to helping communities figure out what they want to be when they grow up. So it's thinking long down the road about, okay, if population growth is coming, what are the types of housing that we want to offer residents in our community? Do we want to be attractive to young millennial families and baby boomers, which are the fastest growing segments of the housing population. So thinking about, what's coming and how can we position ourselves to take advantage of it and be most successful. That's really what the urban planning. So that can happen on all scales. It can happen at the regional scale. In the Portland metro region, we think we've sort of pioneered this idea of thinking regionally, so across multiple cities and counties. But it can also happen at a district or neighborhood scale, so a scale of an area like the Lloyd district, right, can be thought of as a unit. And what are the different components of that district? What's missing? What needs to be invested in? What kinds of businesses and development need to be attracted there? And once you have a vision for a place, a community, a district, or whatever, then you have to calibrate your development regulations such that you can actually build that thing.
Well, let's start there.
Yeah.
It starts with the vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're working with private developers and municipalities on the vision that they have. Mm-hmm. What kind of visions do you typically see cities having? I mean, are they thinking long term, or are they reacting to the things that are coming up?
It's a real combination. I would say that by and large, people want to do the right thing and have very noble, aspirations for their communities. I think that but they also react to whatever's happening, whatever the topic of the day is. And so, recently, housing and affordable housing has been driving a lot of the conversations locally. And, as cities try to craft strategies to deal with and produce more housing and more income restricted housing and just more housing in general, they have to navigate the public who sometimes have a fear of change, and that can be, that can be tricky. But I would say, generally speaking, we work all over the country. We work in red states, blue states, purple states, and generally speaking, people have pretty progressive views on how they want their community to function, no matter where you are. There may be some differences in the way that they talk about the visions, right? So like in Texas, just to pick on Texas, we work in communities big and small, and they, it's not uncommon for those community members to talk about economic prosperity and growth, using, words that are more rooted in dollars and cents. And then, in more West Coast communities, they talk about things with different language, but ultimately people want the same thing, really. They want safety, security, prosperity for themselves and their kids and their grandkids, a healthy, environment, those kinds of things. And so, but the difference between our firm and some other firms is that what we try to do is we try to translate that vision into the relatively boring policy levers that actually become the rules of the road, like zoning, development regulations, incentives, that actually can bring the vision to reality. And I think that's really, really important. It's not the sexy part of, visioning is very inspiring, and you're helping people tell their own story in a compelling way, but ultimately the story can't stop there. It has to translate down into effective policy. And that's where, I've really positioned the firm to work in that area.
So if you're taking the sexy and boiling it down into the nuts and bolts of how do we do this,
Yep.
Does it get diluted along the way?
No, it's not. I've never thought about it that way, but I don't think so. I suppose there is that risk, but we are relatively effective, I would say, at helping people translate their aspirational visions into practical policies that work. Like, for instance, zoning is sort of a critical piece of the urban planning policy world. And, zoning really is sort of the rule book for how cities can get built. It's the rules of the road for developers and builders and homeowners and everybody about what they can do with their property. And if that rule book is broken, then, the vision cannot be realized. And oftentimes people have a very aspirational vision for their community, but, understanding how the vision breaks and falls apart when it encounters zoning or other development incentives is not easy work. It's very technical, right? You have to, the process of understanding zoning, getting a building permit, getting the financing together to get a development project going is a very multidisciplinary process that, you have to have a pretty holistic view in order to diagnose where along that chain things break down, and in what ways, and what changes would have a positive impact on that process of vision to reality. And
what's the 30,000 foot view of zoning for people that aren't familiar with it as you are?
Sure. So zoning is, like I said, it's the manual. It's the owner's manual for residents of a city when it comes to what can get built, where, and under what conditions. So, for instance, on a commercial main street, many communities allow for multiple uses stacked on top of one another, including residential and retail. But like any rule book, the devil is in the details. And we encounter all the time, the rule book that says, this is our mixed use zone, this is our multifamily zone. But then when you add up the rules that govern height, setbacks, open space requirements, parking requirements, impervious surface, all of the different what are called dimensional standards. So the dimensions of whatever kind of building can go on that particular lot. when you add all that up, you actually can't do what the zone aspires to do. And, oftentimes all of those other things result in, a building that is too small to be economically viable. It oftentimes results in buildings that are, very suburban in nature. So, very, very low density, even though, you might be on a historic main street, all you could build is, a Whataburger or whatever, some sort of drive-through situation. And so I see our role as helping people understand, okay, here's your vision. This is what you say you want. These are the buildings, even in your community, that you said, you really like and you want to see more of. Well, here's what your zoning allows you to do. And it's miles and miles apart from what you've said you want. Here's what another set of development regulations, another set of dimensional standards would get you. And it is much closer, or it achieves your vision. Do you like that? Generally speaking, people will say yes, and I want that to happen immediately. And it gives, some pressure to the elected officials to adopt those different zone standards that allow people to achieve their outcomes. But the average citizen is not going to be able to see their way from the vision, navigate through the zoning code, and understand where things fall apart. And so that's one of the primary reasons why cities would hire us, is to go through that diagnostic process.
Well, it seems like that could be a really complex process, because you're talking about not only what kind of use do you want there, but what are the setbacks and then the parking requirements and
Yep.
a lot of the schematics, but also how does it tie into transit and the road system,
Right.
sewage system, and walkability. I know that's a really big thing. What do you see cities and even private developers, are they pushing towards a denser, more walkable, less car oriented community, or are they thinking about something completely different?
It depends on where you are and in the country, but generally speaking, yes, I think there is, you can sort of frame these kind of diagnoses, what we call code audits. You can frame them in any way that your audience will find compelling, right? So, like, for instance, like we talked about before, if affordable housing is a big issue for a community, then it's very helpful to frame and help them understand how their code, their rules that they've set up, are actually creating more unaffordable outcomes, right? Whereas if all you can do on a single family or on a neighborhood standard lot is one large unit, then it's going to be one large expensive unit. And you can help people understand why things are happening the way they are. In the absence of sort of helping them demystify zoning, they just assume that, all developers and builders are just greedy and trying to scrape up every dollar they can. But in truth, it might be that, well, you've only allowed them to build one unit on a standard 5,000 or 6,000 square foot lot as a community. And so that's what they're left with in terms of what they have to build. So helping them demystify some of that can be helpful, and tying it back to the issues that they care about. So, like, in this community in Portland, or housing affordability, in many communities, housing affordability is really, really important. And so helping them demystify where the zoning code is actually exacerbating that problem can be really important. But in another community, it might be, it adds to development cost, and it makes it harder on builders and more expensive on builders. That may be more what they care about, is just government not being in the way, right? It depends on the political persuasion of the audience, but it's the same diagnosis. It's often the same conclusions. It's just how you frame the conversation to get through to the audience. So we interact with the public quite a bit and help them demystify these things.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're projecting out, what is the city or what is the neighborhood going to look like in decades to come?
Yes.
What's the typical timeline that you're looking out?
Well, it really depends on the project. Generally speaking, the larger the geography that we're looking at, the larger the timeline. So, like, for a regional vision, you're looking at 50 or 100 years, right? So you're looking at really large, potentially really large changes in population and jobs, and trying to understand what the future looks like. And so that becomes more challenging. And that's where my business partner, Alex Steinberger, would come in. He's an economist, and he tends to think at those larger geographies. My side of the business, we tend to work at smaller geographies. And as such, the timelines tend to be smaller. So they could be 18 months of a construction period, or it could be 5 years. It tends to be somewhere in that range of what I'm working on. But as a firm, we work on, citywide visions that span many, many decades, down to small development projects that could just be, a year or so.
With those ones that span decades, and you're looking 50 to 100 years out, I mean, we're at this point in time where we're going through such big climactic and societal changes. How on earth do you guys actually say, okay, this is what we think needs to happen. This is how we're going to help guide municipalities and developers through this, so that we can live in a different kind of society that's not playing off of the rule books from 50 years ago?
Yeah, there's no, obviously no one has a crystal ball. And so there's no certainty in going through that process, but there are certain things that have proven themselves pretty effective at making cities resilient across many decades of past development, right? So thinking about compactness, we know from decades of living through it and academic research that sprawl and very, very low density development is extremely unaffordable from a city perspective. So if you have to run 1,000 feet of sewer to serve one house, that is not a good economic prospect from a city's perspective. But if you can get 1,000 units on 50 feet of sewer, then that kind of fiscal health is resilient. And so thinking about policies that help people live in a more compact way, we're not talking about Manhattan compact here. We're just talking about more compact than Americans have traditionally lived. Though that is a resiliency strategy, right? That we know has proven itself very effective. Walkability, right? Walking on 2 feet is not breakthrough technology, but it is part of the human scale of a city, and has proven itself effective. And there's reason to believe that thinking about things and how cities evolve from the point of view of the person, the pedestrian, will position that city to be successful in the future, no matter what happens, right? Accommodating a diversity of uses and housing types. So diversity and resilience are, diversity is a type of resilience that you see across multiple disciplines in the investing world, et cetera. And it plays out in the planning world too. So if you are a monoculture, you are susceptible to very negative things should the future bring change. And the future, if nothing else, always brings change. So if you have 2 flavors of ice cream, and those 2 flavors of ice cream go out of style, you're not going to be very resilient over the long term. So positioning cities to accommodate a variety of different housing styles, to accommodate changing demographics over coming decades, even if we don't know what those demographic groups exactly are, what their preferences are, if we have the ability to be flexible over time, both in terms of housing, but also in terms of employment types, you have better odds of being successful and being resilient than if you are just wholly dependent upon one type of house or one type of job. So we're not any smarter than anyone else. It's just helping cities understand what's worked for communities in the past who have experienced change, and then thinking critically about how technology is changing everything, but also changing the way people interact in cities. In the industry right now, autonomous vehicles are getting a lot of attention, and how they might change the face of cities. And so, trying to understand how technology is going to change how people move around, how they consume, how they interact, how they work. You do your best to try and anticipate those things, but we also try to come back to sort of bedrock principles of sound, human scaled planning that have stood the test of time.
So the sound principles that you're falling back on, how do you think that relates to the sustainability of a city?
There's no better way to sustainably get around a city than on your 2 feet. And so I think they are bedrock because they are sustainable, in my view.
Do you think everybody's just going to walk places, or are you?
No, if they have the option, then a sizable portion of people will walk. I think the point is that sustainability, the simple solution is oftentimes the sustainable solution as well. And so I guess what I'm getting at is the over reliance on technology to help us reduce our carbon footprint, because cars are electrified and all that kind of stuff, I think gets away from really what would be most sustainable is if people were able to self-propel themselves places, right? So walking, biking. So that means that not only do you have to have the walking and biking infrastructure, but it really helps out a lot if you've got housing close to services, not miles and miles and miles apart, right? So that these bedrock principles of compactness and walkability and diversity are incredibly sustainable. Not only are they oftentimes what people want when it comes right down to it in their neighborhood, so it's desirable, but it's also incredibly sustainable. Cities are the biggest source of carbon emissions, right? And that's for a variety of reasons, but our transportation system is a big part of that. And the cleanest way to get around is to get out of one's car and walk or bike, and having those options and being able to do that, practically speaking, requires a well-planned city, and it requires a compact city.
You and I both grew up in communities where that is far from the reality.
Right.
Very urban sprawl type of communities in the southeast part of the United States. I don't even know how you can go from that to what you're talking about. It just seems like there is a big black hole of a chasm in between. And how do we bridge that and put in place, like, okay, this is where we're going. You don't have to be in your SUV getting around town and spending 4 hours just to do groceries, pick up a prescription, and bring your kids to school.
I think you've touched on what I firmly believe is the frontier of the work that our firm does, and many planning firms. I think figuring out how to stitch back together the broken suburbs and incrementally repair them and make them more walkable, more compact, more diverse is the challenge of our time, because it is where the majority of people live. Those places comprise the majority of our cities. They are increasingly undesirable because they don't meet people's modern needs. And it is incumbent upon all of us to do that hard work. It is not easy. Repairing suburbia is incredibly challenging, but it is imperative, because the alternative is just to abandon those places, and that's not sustainable at all. You can't just build something new and replace it. There are places that are harder or easier to repair, and I think there's been some of that work that's happened nationally, but we have far from perfected it. Think about in the last economic cycle, the places that have been most desirable have the attributes I've been talking about. They're walkable, they're closer to town. They tend to be older because we used to build gridded streets and neighborhoods and, have connectivity and mix of uses, et cetera, et cetera. Those places are increasing because there's so little of that. It's like very small percentage of the urbanized area of America has those attributes. Because it's so small, but the demand is so high, those places have become incredibly desirable and incredibly unaffordable. And so we find ourselves now faced with the real acute need of creating more of these walkable places. And the best place to do that is by, fixing what we broke in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and stitching those places back together.
Our listeners. What are some exciting projects that you can think of that was able to go from low density and are on their way towards a more comprehensive and sustainable societal fabric?
Right. There are not that many. Unfortunately, I think the ones that have been successful tend to be large, formerly single owner pieces of land. So like, for instance, an old airport there's an example in Stapleton in the Denver area, or a Miller in the Austin area, where you had old municipal airports that were landlocked and were no longer big enough, and so they moved the airport to some other location, and you had this single landowner that was either some public entity, right? And then that was a public-private partnership that you could establish a cohesive vision and kind of get in there and do the roads and do everything all at once. I think the harder, but those are very rare, right? That you have hundreds, if not thousands of acres in a single ownership that are kind of already surrounded by the city. The challenge is setting up the policy framework, the public infrastructure investment dollars, and the zoning and that thing in places that have really fractured ownership, right? Which is the majority of our cities, right? Where you've got a couple of major arterial roads, major roads with dozens and dozens and dozens of different lots, surrounded by neighborhoods with hundreds of different lots in them. Facilitating those places to transition over time is really hard work, but that's where the majority of our land is, and that's what we need to facilitate change in order to reach all of our other objectives, like reduction in carbon, and reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and things like that, and better transportation. Those are East County. There's literally miles and miles and miles of this type of place in East County, where you've got strip commercial running down whatever street, 122nd or whatever, pick your street, and just off of that you've got tons of residential land, either multifamily or single family. Those areas, and then just go further east and the same pattern continues. It just becomes less and less dense. Those areas need investment in walkable streets, and they can become walkable, compact places that become desirable. It's fascinating to hear stories about places like Alberta, places in Portland, places like Montevilla, right? That for decades were places that you just wanted to drive as quickly as you could through, but now are really thriving heartbeat places that, because development regulations were changed, capital investments were made in the streets and things like that, those places became incredibly desirable. There's no reason why that same recipe cannot be translated out to suburban Washington County, right? In fact, it arguably would be easier, because you've got vast amounts of wealth in a lot of these suburbs waiting for authenticity and real places. And there's just an absence of those things. So if you were able to bring those things into those places, you'd be wildly successful. It's challenging for a whole bunch of different reasons that, sometimes people are unaware of, but Many of these roads are owned by the state, and so the city has very little power over how they can redesign, their quote unquote main street. It could be a state-owned road, and oftentimes, the state has different objectives than the city. So there's a lot of reasons why these things don't happen, but some of them are just inertia. The zoning code in most communities in the U.S. hasn't been updated since I was born, let alone since like the 60s. So we are operating on a rule book that was written when, my parents were kids. And so that's got to change at a minimum.
That's pretty incredible that we're going off of those playbooks. Paint me a picture of what it would look like if you were to have even a private developer with land like that. How do you take it to be that sustainable vision? Because you're talking about walkability. You're implying that they're walking to work. Is that right?
Given the opportunity, people say they would prefer to be able to walk to work. Most people do not, cannot, live in places where that is not physically possible or safe. But if you talk to people about what their preferences are, they would say, I would like to be able to walk to work. I would like to be able to walk to do all my errands. I'd like to be able to for my kids to walk to school. And so there is a preference for that lifestyle. It's just that, less than 2% of the city landmass that we've developed as a country is actually physically possible to do that in. And so if you're a real estate developer and there's an unmet need for something, you're going to go and try and produce that thing. I think cities need to start thinking a little bit more like that on a grander scale regionally, that, look, this is how people want to live. We have to start converting some of the places that we've done wrong, that we've messed up, that are not this way, into places where people can achieve what they say they want to do. And as a result of that, not only is the city or our cities meeting the needs of their desires of their residents, all of a sudden, they're also meeting their climate objectives, right? Because if you can walk, and if you can bike, and if you can walk to school, all that kind of stuff, it means you're not getting in your car, and maybe the household doesn't need 2 cars anymore, and household expenses are then reduced. It has all of these other co-benefits, but at the end of the day, it's actually what people want. That's the sort of, this is not some conspiracy theory of liberals to get people to to outlaw cars and those kinds of things. It's like, this is just what people want, and so let's make it easier for people to get what they want.
Taking away people's cars and the American dream. Here goes single family houses out the window.
Yeah, well, it's interesting though, because people make assumptions about what Americans want, but if you actually look at the data, the majority of Americans would be willing to trade a yard to be walkable to their job or to their kids' school, right? Like, they can't, but they end up buying a house where they can afford a house. They get a yard, but they're making a trade-off that they would rather not have to make. So there's a difference between what people do because out of necessity and what people want. And I think we should make it easier for people to do what they want, because it is the more sustainable path. It's not forcing them to do anything.
Do you see a population trend going more urban and not looking for that suburban house or a house with a yard?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, if you look at just purely at the numbers, what's driving and will drive the housing market for at least a couple decades to come is 1 and 2 person households that are either older baby boomers or younger millennials. They are very much interested in walkability, bikeability. They're very much, they're not, their calculus in their mind does not favor a 30-minute commute in order to have a yard. It favors, less than a 10-minute commute and maybe somewhere for their dog to use the bathroom in the back, not a big expansive yard. Or a park, right? Some other shared community amenity, neighborhood school, those kinds of things. So there has been, and there will be increasingly a trend toward that. The big question is whether cities can adapt to that need quickly enough to accommodate this demographic moment in time, right? Like, demographics are never static. So, but cities adapt relatively slowly. And so the cities that are adapting faster, investing in their historic districts and investing in recalibrating some of their suburban areas to be attractive to these people, they will succeed. They will succeed in being attractive to, the drivers of housing and the economy. The ones that don't, they are less likely to succeed. And so there's going to be winners and losers in this. And I think even across our region, you see some of that where, places like, Happy Valley have lots of fresh new housing, but they don't have any of the other ingredients of a community, where they have very few of them, right? Like the walkability and the diversity and access to services, those kinds of things. Whereas, places like Beaverton, they've invested a lot in their downtown and the surrounding area in order to be attractive to those types of folks. And I think that will serve them for a long, long period of time, continue to serve them.
So we're talking about encouraging multiple uses. Investment will follow. The form is there with the zoning that you're setting in place. And so you're really casting out a pretty wide net that spans decades in order to fill in, not something, okay, next week we're going to update our zoning and this is going to be built out and we're ready to go. We're a more resilient community because of this. Like, it sounds like you're putting in building blocks that take a long time to mature into.
They do. And I think because like I said, so many communities, like we're working in the city of Austin, they haven't updated their zoning code since the 1980s. You don't update your rule book every day. And there's a lot of good reasons, not to update the rule book and change the rules of the game every day. So when you do it, it's a big deal, right? And it has decades and decades of implications. And so, we need to think long-term about these things, because a very small percentage of any city gets recycled, gets reused and reimagined in any one person's lifetime. And so these things take a while to take hold. And so you don't get very many bites at the apple. So it's very important to get it as right as you can in the moments that we get. So I hope on my tombstone, it'll say something to the effect of, Alex helped many communities get the stupid out of their zoning. Because it's really important that we not make stupid decisions, because they, when it comes to the life cycle of a city, they last forever. It's not like screwing up and buying the wrong cell phone and go out and get another one. It's like you get the wrong building or the wrong string of buildings in place, those suckers aren't moving for a while. And so, you want to do this stuff as right as you can from the get-go.
What do you think individual people can do to help advance this and to help sculpt the vision of their community?
The short answer is show up. There's a great generational divide in the people that show up to public meetings and the people who don't. There are a lot of baby boomers that show up to these public meetings, and they end up shaping and sculpting the future, a future that they're not going to be here for. And, the people who will be living with the future that's getting sculpted at any given time often are not at the table. And it's not because they, to some extent, whether or not you can go to a public meeting at 5 p.m. is circumstantial, but I mean, there are many, many people who ought to be at the table shaping the community who just aren't. And so show up, I think, is the first thing. Participate in, planning your city, I think is the first thing. But also don't get distracted by shiny objects. Like driverless cars and things like that are not going to save our cities. They're not going to save, the interstate system was presented as a breakthrough technology that was going to improve life dramatically, and it was great for the early adopters when no one else was on the freeway. But now when you're spending 2 hours to get from one side of LA to the other, it doesn't look so great. So, don't assume that some technology is going to save us. It's really the hard work of creating walkable, compact parts of town that's really going to be what serves us well over the long term. But it's hard work, and dealing with people's fears is very important. Change. No one likes change, and everyone likes change less as they get older. And so helping people understand the trade-offs associated with change and why it, on balance, makes sense is incredibly important. And that takes time. The public process is painfully slow sometimes. But there are reasons, if done well, that it can mean that you've developed leaders or you've developed people in the community who understand the trade-offs well enough that the change actually sticks around for a while. And so there's some value in doing it. But, anyway, those are some ways I think people could really make a big difference.
Well, it sounds like you've got quite the job security going forward. There's a lot of work to be doing in our communities, and I think it's awesome. Show up, get active. I haven't heard much from you about Gen X. We're just going to assume they're living out in the suburbs, and
No, they're not that many of them, but they, generally speaking, they like what everyone else likes. They like a nice little place to live where they can get everywhere very easily, and their kids are safe and happy. It's kind of was true, many years ago, and it's true today. It's just that I think we're doing a better job translating that into resilient, sustainable neighborhoods. So
yeah,
I'm a believer that at the end of the day, most people, regardless of their political persuasion, want basically the same thing. And we're actually closer together than we are far apart. When you strip away all of the language, the different language that people use, that's, I think, a very important part of the work that we do, is helping people see the common interests of neighbors, and helping them understand each other's wants and desires, and how actually they're very close together. And that's how you build the consensus for really lasting, policy.
And that's exactly why I wanted to have you on this show. Is I don't know anybody else that has such fluidity of working across the country with disparate community interest of, okay, what do people want and how are we doing it? Because you're saying, at the end of the day, people want, safe neighborhoods, a good place to raise a family. They don't want to be commuting all over the place, and they want a nice house to live in. It's not rocket science. And I would throw in another layer of people generally want to live healthy lives. They don't want to live in a community where the air is unsafe, the water isn't drinkable, and we've got tumors growing out of our side. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what color jersey you're wearing. We want a clean, functional, vibrant community.
Yep.
rather, or whether it be an urban city or something a little bit smaller than a larger city, in our secondary and tertiary markets. But no, it's really cool. It sounds like there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of really hard work that goes into it. So I appreciate what you're doing out there. And I wanted other people to know, like, this is the kind of stuff that's happening, and this is the really hard work. It's not the sexy work. It's not the new shiny building that's getting developed, that's mixed use and, you know, is LEED platinum and all that, but it's informing what's going to be built in the future and how it's going to look. So
well, thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time coming on this. Alex, how can people find out more about your company and get a hold of you?
Sure. Well, Cascadia Partners, Cascadia-partners.com is the website. And I assume in the links for the podcast, there will be contact information for myself as well, but Cascadia-partners.com is the website.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Alex. I appreciate your time, and it's been an awesome conversation. If you're interested in looking up Alex, please be sure to check out his website. They do awesome work. I've gotten to understand the method behind the madness over the couple of years that we've been talking together. So thanks so much, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.